Greetings, my name is Louise Dente and I welcome you to yet another edition of Cultural Caravan. On this edition is a special as we are going to discuss the topic of critical race theory, a topic that has become very controversial over the last few years. We are here at a local college and we're really ready to begin our conversation with our three distinguished guests. Are you ready? Well, I am. Let's go.
So of course, there's a need to have information like this in our history books, whether we talk about locally, nationally, or for that matter, internationally. So the question at this particular point really is, are people getting so upset in regards to this issue of critical race theory?
There was a black neighborhood called Seneca Village, which under eminent domain because it was a thriving black community, but back decades ago, before the civil rights movement, the city of New York decided that it did not want these black people to be living there, so they confiscated the land. They did not compensate those people, and they made a park out of it. Now, this didn't just happen there, this happened all over the country. There was a place in Forsyth County, Georgia called Oscarville, another thriving black community. And this community as well was flooded now. They took the land away from the people, flooded the land, and did not compensate any of the black residents. And right now there's a lake that is in the place where this black community was. This also happened in Indiana. This happened, there's a place called Bruce's Beach, which is, we know about from recent times that they had to compensate the descendants of the people who had land that was these black people whose land was confiscated by the municipality because through racist reasons. But these are examples of black towns and villages, thriving communities that were flooded or condemned or dispossessed due to racial reasons, and these people were never compensated. And it's only because of people now doing investigations that they find out about this. This is not in the history books, it's not taught by the municipalities. And a lot of people, once they hear about some of these things, become uncomfortable, especially with reparations arguments in this day and age.
And also, and briefly too, a lot of cemeteries got totally destroyed and became buildings or parking lots.
Exactly, and I just want to add to it, as you said, the banning of books, where you have books on Martin Luther King or other civil rights leaders or people who struggled being banned. That is a concern. All children need to learn the history. That is a concern when certain books are being removed. It is a concern when you're not hearing, like as we said, we shared with you some of the impact of enslavement and how people were left with a negative thought as it relates to people of African ancestry or black people, that understanding that African Americans have made contributions. I mean, one of the things, how many of you saw the movie Hidden Figures? Raise your hand. Okay. Now, in that movie, a lot of people didn't know that there were black women who were very much involved with the space program, because you didn't really see that. Okay, the only thing you saw was space, Star Trek, a fictional program with a black woman, the Lieutenant Uhura. That's what I saw back in the day. But you didn't really see that connection in knowing that that impact of these women who had on the space program. Even in terms of GPS, many of you drive. There was an African American woman who was responsible for that. Okay, I'm just saying that all of our children need to know all of the story. That's the reason why we're saying that the whole impact where we're telling people not to study. And, you know, in history, there are goods and bads. We know that there were atrocities created in Europe where 6 million Jews were exterminated because of the Holocaust. That was a horrible thing that happened. But Germans still tell that history to teach their children never again should that ever happen. So when we think about the horrors of enslavement, yes, it was a horror, but how can we use it as a teachable moment to say, yes, enslavement happened, but how can we ensure that people in this country are never enslaved like that again? We've got to teach it. We've got to tell the truth. We can't just celebrate the glory. We have to also talk about the things that were not so good. To say, just like as a parent, we want to, So I'm saying that is the concern with the backlash is that we're not sharing the story, the full American story, and we're not really using history as a way to teach our children about some of the things that may have happened many moons ago that are still impacting us and how we can ensure that we don't repeat it. So that's something we just wanted to ensure we left with you. And just for the sake of time, I just wanted to briefly ask the panel to think about, to talk about, and I know that a lot's happening. Let me just say to you that we wanted to have some question and answer, so we're going to kind of conclude our presentation by each of the panelists coming up with some recommendations for infusing African American history in the curriculum. Okay, so I'm going to start with Dr. Seraile. Briefly tell us what you would suggest.
Sure. I mean, there's a lot of books on African American history. You can just Google those on Amazon, for example. But also you have videos like Eyes on the Prize. It talks about the civil rights movement. There are other documentaries that are certainly useful for class instructions. One thing I'd like to add is that when people talk about CRT, all they're trying to do is to scare people. I'm old enough to remember back in the 50s when I was in school that they talked about communism. You just say communist or communism and people would shy away from whatever was being discussed because they didn't want to be tainted with that label. In 1955, after the Supreme Court said schools should be integrated, it developed in the South what were called white citizens councils. The main objective was to keep the schools segregated. But they used scare tactics, and one of the things they used were cartoons, again showing these brute Negroes as potential rapists. And even more clearly, they would have the door to the schoolhouse wide open, and down the end of the hall, the door would say bedroom. So the implications were if you integrate the schools, like little white girls would be at risk. So you have to talk about the history, like Louise said, good and not so good. And if I can teach myself as I did African American history, it was a lot harder back when I did it in the 60s than it would be today, because so much is available for anyone to teach themselves to just add to what you are getting in the classrooms.
Thank you. Soraya?
I think that there is a great amount of Black history that just is not known, has not been told. We see, and more of it needs to be told on the big screen. More of it needs to, there are so many stories. I think about the story of, there's a book called Bourgeois Radicals. I believe the author is Carol Williams, I'm not sure the last name, but it's about the participation of the NAACP and other prominent Black people at the time during the 1940s in the United Nations, and how they had a great hand in forming some of the rules that were set for nations that were being freed from colonialism. They had a hand in that. and they had recommendations that were taken so that the former colonizers were not able to recolonize certain areas that were in flux and weren't really agreed upon. That is a voice in Black history that I had never heard of before I heard the author do a lecture on it. And I don't think most people know about it either. There's so many stories that need to come out about people who advocated for freedom and the rights of people. Some of our inventors who invented some of the things that America, I can't imagine America without them. There's something on the railroads that they use called a cup by a man named Elijah McCoy, a Black man who invented it. There was a time when it was very dangerous for people who worked on the trains because they had to constantly lubricate to keep the engine running. And he created something called it's a cup, and that allowed for for it to automatically be lubricated without the danger to the engineer trying to make sure the train kept running. That's where the name The Real McCoy comes from, him, because there were knockoffs that turned out not to be so good, and so people wanted the real McCoy to make sure that they had the real object, and so that for safety's sake. And there are other Black inventors. I can't imagine America without our Black inventors, because they invented so much that we take for granted today. The ironing board, the stoplight, a lot of our internet that we use today. There were Black inventors who were major contributors to that, but we're not told this, and we need to hear the whole history instead of a partial history.
Thank you. All right. Basir, I'm sorry, we have about
Very
1.5
quickly,
minutes.
very quickly,
Yes.
my approach is infusion across the curriculum. It's not a matter of just teaching African or African-American history. It needs to be in all subjects. So when we deal with literature, we need to learn of the African and African-American writers who write. When we deal with science, we need to understand that Lewis Latimer should get credit for the light bulb and not necessarily Thomas Edison. Because as was said, not only does Latimer hold the patent for the carbon filament, but he also holds the patent for the screwed base of the bulb. And how do light bulbs work? Without that, we would have no light bulb. So Latimer needs to be in the science curriculum along with all these other people. When we talk about philosophy, we need to understand that people like Socrates and Plato studied in Africa before they went ahead and became Greek philosophers. We need to understand these things, and they need to be in all curriculum areas. It's not just a matter of history for history's sake, because then, if that's the case, we literally segregate that particular information in one place. It needs to be everywhere.
Okay, with that said, I just want to first of all thank our presenters for sharing. I hope you found informed thoughts, food for thought. And really quick, we wanted to allow for some dialogue. So I wanted to know if you have any questions, feel free to line up at either of the mics on either side. If you have any questions for any of our presenters at this time.
Why do you think that in recent years that the right has taken such a strong hold over CRT and created such a culture war around it when it's been around for so long?
Because the same as I said before about saying communist or communism, people were taught that's evil, they're going to destroy America. So you say CRT, that's all you need to say, because people already know what they think it means, and it means that they're going to blame white people for all the evils. They're going to blame books. Yeah, a book on someone like a young girl named Ruby Bridges went to school in New Orleans, kind of like first grade. escorted by federal marshals. That should be a kind of book that would tell people the United States Constitution is working, because it talks about equal protection under the law. And she should be glorified as a young girl who was very brave to go to school being escorted by federal marshals. So why is that kind of book banned? Because people, again, want to make it something a stigma, and you say CRT for that. I want to know about that. Anything you think of, just say CRT, just like I said, when I was in school, communism. We had this invited guest to my college in 1962, who was the leader of the Communist Party of the United States, invited by students. The president said, no, you can't have them, get canceled. Because the legislature is going to say, we're going to cut your funding. We're going to have a communist on campus. I mean, there are people now who can't even go to certain colleges and talk about CRT because they'll get banned by the administration.
And at this particular point, there are parents who want books banned that they've never read, that they've never seen, that they know absolutely nothing about. But, I mean, we have to understand that this is political, and it's part of a political movement at this time. But thank you for your question.
Thank you.
I just want to know, as a young person trying to be knowledgeable, these things, like, how can we go about making a difference in that?
Well, there are movements, international movements, as you know, that are asking for these artifacts to be returned from where they originated, because most of them have literally been stolen. Recently, in terms of the Museum of Natural History, one of the things they have is they have human remains. And recently, the last couple of weeks, there's been really major discussion in regards to going ahead and seeing if these remains can be treated with the kind of respect that we would think as far as human remains go. So it's an ongoing movement, and I think the major thing in terms of young people is when they go to these particular institutions to ask the question. I think that's the approach. I think that the concept should be is that these are borrowed artifacts, that they're on loan as long as wherever they're from is comfortable with, quote, loaning them, and that the idea would be is that at some particular point, if that particular country or region or people would want those artifacts back, they could literally get them back. But thank you for that question.
Thank you.
I just wanted to find out about, I know there's a big issue with CRT in Florida. Do you know exactly what Governor DeSantis had a problem with? I don't see a problem with CRT, but what was their problem with CRT in the schools there? Do you know? Or?
I mean, that's a rough one. There was the issue of the advanced placement course. That was a major point, an inflection point, so to speak, where there was a advanced placement course in African American history that sought to literally teach the true history. And there were people who took exception to that. Now, the courageous thing would have been for the agency that goes ahead and deals with advanced placement tests to go ahead and say, this is what we came up with, and this is what the course will look like, and we're not going to change it. But the pressure from states like Florida and Texas really made them change it. One of the interesting things is that when textbooks are actually published, that they're generally published so that they're acceptable to states like Florida and Texas. So what that means is if in fact something is objectionable in Florida, very often it will not appear in that particular textbook. So very often the textbooks that we may have in New Jersey are going to be the same textbook that would be in Florida. And of course that'll be a problem because much of the information that we would like is not going to be in that textbook.
Yeah, and also too, part of it is what they call the 1619 Project, which started to put African American and American history at the center. And people objected that President Trump talked about 1776. if you think about it, African Americans as a historical group has been in the center of American history, because you look at the Constitution, they decided what they're going to do about importation of Africans to America. So they had a compromise to stop it in 1808. What are you going to do about counting the slaves as part of the population for the House of Representatives? They had a compromise. Count them as 3/5. When they talk about westward expansion, all the areas that became part of the Louisiana Purchase, from Louisiana up to Canada and up to Oregon. They're talking about can slavery expand to the territories. When you talk about the Civil War, can slavery exist? Reconstruction, can black people vote? So all throughout American history, African Americans have been started at the center of it. But to discuss that means, why are you going to put them in that position? Why should they belong in that position? So you want to change that, then you say, no, you can't talk about those kinds of things. I mean, it's amazing because if the things about the Constitution that there is stuff on paper, but then when you have examples how the Constitution is being implemented, that should be a teaching lesson right there. The Constitution said, equal rights and so forth. Then you prove it by saying, okay, now we're going to integrate the military because we have African American men who can do the same jobs. I mean, the thing about World War I, the black soldiers were all segregated to the point that some of them end up fighting on the side of France, wearing France uniforms and carrying the weapons of France and getting medals from the French, and they came home and they got lynched. So how can you ignore something like that? See, we talk about Tuskegee Airmen. That came about because Mrs. Roosevelt, Eleanor Roosevelt, pulled some strings and said, let's have a test, have an opportunity. And they were saying at that time, well, black men can't fly because they'll get sick and throw up because the planes got to go up and down and sideways and stuff. But then they proved that they were more capable than a lot of the white pilots because they were escorting the big bombers. And the big bombers began to realize these guys are pretty good, and they began to ask for them when they go on these missions. See, that's all part of the history. So if you don't talk about it, then you don't know anything about it. And so you think that African American people have no contribution to America. And it's amazing because if students, I have students from all over the world. I have students from the Czech Republic, India, Pakistan, Ecuador, Caribbean, West Africa, Israel. I had a student from Israel who was in the Israeli army at one point, but she's a minority because her father came from Yemen and her mother came from Morocco, and they are Sephardic Jews who are being discriminated against. And she took my course in civil rights, and the last day she said to me, Israel needs a civil rights movement. She'd never gotten that except being in my class. I never said anything about Israel needed a civil rights movement. I never even talked about Israel. But that's just her observation based on what she saw about civil rights here in America.
So basically what we're saying, thank you, is that, the danger right now, particularly we're talking to you, you're, educated people, is that if our books are going to be changed to reflect another mindset, in this case, children are not learning, able to learn, we are not going to be able to get the full story to see about how is that going to impact our society 10, 15, 20, 30 years from now, when students have a skewed understanding of history. So that's something that we just, want you to think about, the impact of these conversations. What's going on now will have long-term implications. And we hope that today we had an opportunity to at least share some thoughts, with you, to share some thoughts with further conversation as you go amongst your peers and others, and as you listen to reports to understand what it is. And we hope that we've brought some understanding, and we certainly look forward to other opportunities. But before then, I want to sincerely thank our distinguished professor, Charlotte Langveld, for inviting us. It's easy to step out, to want to do things like this, to share information. And I have to thank you because she was very persistent and just saying, look, we're going to do this, we're going to make this happen. And so you're lucky to have her as a educator here at the campus. And I look forward to Well, I hope you've enjoyed this broadcast, and we continue to encourage you to tune in, to write, and to tell a friend. But please visit our website at www.ccptv.org. But until next time, Louise Dente saying thank you. If you would like to support these broadcasts, we encourage you to send contributions to P.O. Box 300851, Jamaica, New York 11430. Thank you.